know what I mean? We both represent, you know what I mean? Both sides of the game. The calm one and the relentless one.
Right there. I didn't even know this is Blood neighborhood and this is Snoop Dogg and Warren G. Like young Crips, not like active gangbanging, but we Crips, but don't know. We going there to get to that. So this is probably about 2 months. We going to every day.
Snoop Dogg has just got sentenced, and this is shaking the hip-hop world like a final verdict no one saw coming. A legend once untouchable is now dragged into a storm of brutal allegations, buried loyalties, and a past that refuses to stay silent. This is about an era ending in silence, shock, and irreversible consequences. The night in Las Vegas started like a celebration, but inside the death row circle, something felt off.
But, you know, we always feel like we keeping it real, not scratch that. We always felt like we're being true to everything we've always stayed representing.
Tupac Shakur was at the peak of everything. His album was dominating, his name carried weight everywhere, and Death Row Records was running hip-hop like an empire. But behind that success, the atmosphere was tense. People weren't moving the same. Conversations were shorter. Trust was thinner. One of the most repeated claims from that night involved Snoop Dogg allegedly warning Daz Dillinger not to go to Las Vegas. The message, as it has been told over the years, was simple. Don't come, something is going to happen. That detail matters because it shifts the story from reaction to anticipation. It raises a hard question that has never gone away. How would anyone know that before the shooting happened? Then there's the communication issue that keeps coming back. According to statements made by Suge Knight, Snoop allegedly had access to live updates through a Nextel radio system while Tupac was in Las Vegas. The implication isn't just about location, it's about proximity to information. In a situation where only a small group should have known what was unfolding, that detail created long-lasting suspicion. But the strangest part of the story doesn't start in Las Vegas. It starts after the shooting. Snoop has described an emotional moment in the hospital, saying he saw Tupac on life support, overwhelmed by what he saw, and even fainting during the visit. That version of events stood for years in interviews and public appearances. Then Suge Knight challenged it directly. He stated that Snoop never came to the hospital at all. Now the story splits in two completely different directions. One version built on grief and presence, the other built on absence. There's no middle ground between those two accounts. And that gap is what turned this into a long running point of tension inside hip-hop history. Because if Snoop didn't go, then the question changes. It's no longer about what he saw. It becomes about why the story was told that way in the first place. At that time, Death Row wasn't just a record label. It was a closed system. Loyalty wasn't optional. Decisions were influenced by pressure, fear, and status. Inside that environment, even small statements carried weight. Before everything collapsed, Tupac and Snoop actually worked at the highest level together. Tracks like Two of America's Most Wanted weren't just collaborations. They were signals of unity inside a label that was dominating global rap culture. Tupac brought intensity and urgency. Snoop brought control and rhythm. Together, they shaped a sound that defined an era. But inside the label, dynamics were shifting fast. As Tupac's presence grew stronger, multiple former insiders later described a change in atmosphere. Attention moved toward him. The energy around the label became more centered on his output. In industries built on ego, that kind of shift creates friction, even without direct conflict. Then came the moment that widened the gap. Snoop publicly expressed respect for the notorious B.I.G. during a period when East Coast and West Coast tensions were already boiling. In that environment, neutrality wasn't seen as neutrality. It was interpreted as alignment. And within Death Row's internal logic, alignment mattered more than intention. Tupac took it personally. That shift changed how people inside the circle viewed Snoop. What used to be a friendship started to look like uncertainty. Around the same period, Snoop later revealed another moment that shaped his mindset. He was removed from his usual security protection before a private flight connected to the Death Row group. He described the feeling as unsafe enough that he carried a knife and fork during the trip because he didn't know what to expect from the people around him anymore. That detail matters because it shows how quickly trust had broken down inside the system. And then, just days later, Tupac was shot in Las Vegas. After that, nothing inside hip-hop stayed the same. The stories didn't stop. The contradictions didn't settle. Instead, they multiplied. Every interview added another layer. Every old memory became evidence in someone else's theory. Snoop's name stayed attached to those conversations, not because anything was proven, but because the timeline around him contained too many unresolved details that never fully aligned. And in a case that still has no official closure in the public mind, those gaps are enough to keep the story alive. Things didn't always feel like a war inside death row. There was a time when it actually looked like family.
You know what I mean? We both represent, you know what I mean? Both sides of the game. The calm one and the relentless one. And no one knows which side is more appropriate or which side is more profitable. But we're showing you both sides. And if you look at our lives and look at our music, you'll see where each side takes us. Because right now, we side by side, hitting them up.
Tupac Shakur and Snoop Dogg didn't just work together. They clicked in a way that felt almost too natural. The studio sessions weren't formal at all. It was more like chaos mixed with genius. Beats playing loud, people talking over each other, smoke everywhere, and somehow in the middle of all that noise, songs were getting made that would define an era. During the All Eyes on Me era, Tupac wasn't just recording music, he was moving like a man on a mission. And Snoop was right there in that energy. When they linked on two of America's Most Wanted, it didn't feel like a feature. It felt like two forces syncing up perfectly. Tupac came in sharp, intense, almost aggressive. Snoop balanced it out like he was gliding through the beat without even trying. That contrast is exactly why it worked. And the bond wasn't just studio deep. Tupac actually pushed Snoop in public too. He made sure Snoop was seen, heard, and respected at a time when visibility meant everything. He spoke about him like family, not just a label mate. In interviews and appearances, he didn't play the industry game with fake compliments. If he had your back, you knew it. And Snoop had that backing. There were also those lighter moments people always forget. The late night studio laughs, the weed sessions that somehow turned into music, brainstorming, and those random conversations where nothing made sense until a hit record came out of it later. It didn't feel calculated. It felt real. That's what makes everything that came after feel heavier. Because at that point, nobody was thinking about cracks forming. But inside Death Row Records, things were shifting fast. As Tupac's presence grew, so did his influence. He wasn't just another artist anymore. He was becoming the center of attention. Conversations changed when he walked in. Decisions started orbiting around him. Even insiders later said it felt like the entire label was slowly moving in his direction. And when that happens in any high-pressure environment, someone always feels it. Snoop, at the same time, started getting pushed slightly to the side. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The spotlight that once naturally followed him started splitting. Tupac was everywhere. Interviews, headlines, studio energy, even internal discussions. He was becoming the main character of Death Row without officially being called that. And that's where things get dangerous. Because inside a world built on fame, money, ego, and street politics, shifts like that don't just stay emotional. They turn psychological. Jealousy doesn't always show up loud. Sometimes it shows up as distance. Sometimes it shows up as silence. Sometimes it shows up as people just moving differently around each other. Then came the BET interview moment. Snoop casually mentioned respect for the notorious B.I.G., and in any normal situation, that wouldn't even be a headline. But this wasn't normal. The East Coast-West Coast tension was already boiling, and inside Death Row, loyalty wasn't flexible. It was absolute. Tupac didn't see it as an opinion. He saw it through loyalty rules. In that world, your enemies weren't just yours, they belonged to everyone standing with you. Snoop, on the other hand, was trying to cool things down. He wasn't built for constant war energy, but peace didn't match the mood inside the label anymore. And that's where paranoia started creeping in. Some people inside Death Row allegedly started looking at Snoop differently. Not openly, but enough for him to feel it. Words like traitor started floating around in the background. Even Tupac's trust reportedly started shifting, with suspicions that Snoop wasn't fully aligned anymore.
My own opinion, we represent the nucleus of the entire ghetto. I represent the hardcore, grab at you, no holds barred, no prisoners, relentless, hustle to the early morning hustler type of person, thug, you know? And Snoop represent the more calm, all legit, right by the book, no waves, let's get our business handled.
And once that kind of doubt enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. It spreads. The friendship didn't die overnight. It died sentence by sentence. Then came the private jet incident. Snoop arrived expecting the usual setup. Security, familiar faces, routine movement. Instead, his security was denied access. Just like that. No warning, no explanation that made sense. That's when things shifted in his mind too. He later described grabbing a knife and fork, not because it made sense, but because fear doesn't always ask for logic. On that flight, he wasn't relaxed. He was calculating survival. Even sitting under a blanket, he felt exposed in a way that didn't match fame, money, or success. It felt like trust inside death row had fully collapsed. Fear had replaced comfort, and loyalty didn't mean what it used to. 3 days later, Tupac Shakur was gone, and nothing inside hip-hop ever felt the same again.
I was so happy that Pac was out of jail, you know what I'm saying? I was happy, and I was like, damn, I got to give up my best performance.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? To compliment him and not to take nothing away from him, but to let him know that I'm with him. It's just like, okay, the song is 4 minutes, right? You got a certain amount of time to say what you gonna say.
Things inside Death Row Records didn't just fall apart overnight. It slowly turned into something darker, almost like everyone started speaking in half sentences and side eyes. One of the moments that keeps coming back in conversations is Suge Knight's claim about a later collaboration involving Snoop Dogg and Daz Dillinger with DeAndre Smith, a name that fans often connect to the larger conspiracy surrounding Tupac Shakur's death. Now, on paper, it sounds like just another industry collaboration, but in this story, nothing is ever just music, because the moment that name entered the conversation, people didn't hear a track. They heard a question, a very uncomfortable one. Why would anyone work with someone even remotely tied to the circle, accused of being around Tupac's final night? That single idea was enough to ignite years of suspicion. And this is where things stop being just history and start turning into internet culture fuel. Because once this story hit forums, YouTube breakdowns, podcasts, and comment sections, it never stayed in one place. It multiplied. Every interview got rewatched. Every old clip got slowed down. Every facial expression got analyzed like it was a courtroom testimony. People weren't just listening anymore. They were investigating. And the internet has a strange way of doing that. Silence becomes evidence. A pause becomes suspicious. A normal interview becomes a hidden confession if you zoom in enough times. That's why this part of the story never died. It kept feeding itself. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, one idea kept floating around like a shadow. In hip-hop, silence can look guilty, but collaboration looks even worse. That line basically became the heartbeat of every conspiracy discussion around this case, but the story doesn't stop at Snoop. Doesn't stop. Because according to Suge Knight's larger claims, this was never just about one label, one artist, or one night in Las Vegas. He started pointing at something much bigger. A system, a culture, a machine that runs on control. He talked about exploitation inside the industry, about manipulation disguised as mentorship, about power games that most artists don't even realize they are walking into until it's too late. The way he describes it, success in that world doesn't come free. It comes with strings attached, invisible ones. And when Tupac entered that system, he wasn't playing by the usual rules. That's where things get even more complicated. Because Tupac Shakur wasn't quiet. He wasn't predictable. He wasn't controllable in the way the industry liked. He spoke too directly. He moved too emotionally. He reacted too fast. And most importantly, he didn't filter his words for comfort. That kind of personality creates two reactions in powerful environments. People either follow you or fear you.
We both know what wavelength we on, so he come out with an idea and I'll automatically be like, yeah, that's it. Same thing, vice versa.
And in the late 90s hip-hop world, fear was already everywhere. The East versus West tension wasn't just music rivalry anymore. It was an identity. It was loyalty tests. It was survival language. And inside that chaos, even bigger names like Sean Combs were being pulled into conversations about influence, control, and behind-the-scenes power structures. Whether all of it is true or exaggerated, the important part is this: the culture of suspicion was already fully alive. So when Tupac started becoming louder, more unpredictable, and more influential, it created a kind of pressure nobody openly admitted. Because unpredictable people inside controlled systems don't stay comfortable for long. They either get managed or they get removed from the conversation entirely. And that's where the darkest version of this theory comes in. Not just street conflict, not just label drama, but something bigger sitting behind the curtain. Maybe Tupac's death wasn't just street violence, maybe it was bigger than rap. That idea is what keeps this story alive decades later. Not proof, not closure, just the uncomfortable space where answers should be. After everything collapsed, Snoop's world changed completely. He eventually left Death Row, stepping into a new chapter with Master P and No Limit Records. And this wasn't just a career move, it felt like survival. He openly spoke about learning ownership, learning contracts, learning how to actually control his work instead of being controlled by it. The contrast was clear. On one side, Suga's world felt heavy, intense, and unpredictable. On the other side, Master P's approach felt more structured, more business-driven, more about long-term control. Snoop has also admitted in different ways that fear played a role in that transition. Not fear of failure, but fear of the environment he was leaving behind. And that's the irony that sticks. The same label that turned him into a global name also became the place he had to escape from to feel safe again. By the time Snoop walked away, Death Row wasn't just struggling. It was already turning into something people would later describe as a ghost of what it used to be. By the time Snoop escaped, Death Row was already becoming a graveyard. And that brings everything into today, because this story never really ended. It just changed platforms. Now it lives in interviews, comment sections, documentaries, and late-night debates. People still go back to it because there is no final answer that satisfies everyone. Every explanation opens another question. Every theory leads to another angle. And somehow, after all these years, Snoop is still inside that conversation. Not because anything new was proven, but because silence leaves space and the internet never stops filling empty space with theories. Maybe that's why this story refuses to die. Because it isn't just about what happened in 1996, it's about everything that was never fully explained after it.